Welcome everyone to panelists and audience to our first Dialogue with Dignity event. I'm Alice Mayer, and I'm going to introduce the project by telling you a little something about myself and how this project came to be. I've been a psychiatrist and a classical psychoanalyst in New York City for over 40 years. And I like to say that for the first quarter century of my life, I was a religious Catholic. And for the second quarter century, I was a religious Freudian. Now those models aren't all that different. They're both about the power of human nature, a shared search for meaning, human connection. But now the third quarter century of my life, I'm looking in a different direction. My field has transitioned sort of away from a dark exploration of the dark side of the human soul to something more superficial. It's about medication management and behavioral skills. And the psychodynamics are writ large. They're on the world stage. We're surrounded by them and we don't know what to do with them. We're conflicted, but more than just that, we're regressing to the point where we're fragmenting, we're losing our center, we're losing our sense of morality, reality testing, respect for one another. If you think differently from me, it's perfectly okay for me to call you a idiot sheeple libtard or an idiot racist Nazi. And we attack and defend, we ridicule and shame one another, and it goes nowhere. It widens divides. Now, human divides. Our species is brilliant at bridging divides when we want to. We can fly to Mars. In fact, we're en route as we speak. I think we left on Thursday. I'm talking to you from all over the world. Hi, Paul in England. We can do it if we want to, but we don't know how to do it between two people who think differently from one another. And I will insist that it is possible. I like to say that human understanding is rocket science. And if we treat it as such, we can actually begin to make some inroads. And that's what this project is about. It's about starting from a different place from our usual political dialogues, starting from humanizing one another. We're just gonna ask, like, how did you get to be who you are? Tell us something about yourself that helps us understand how you arrived at your political positions. And speak from a personal center and from humanizing each other. One more thing, one metaphor that I like to use that I think is important. It's based on Freud's body ego, and that's the body politic. Now my body has a right and left side for a very good reason. My right hand is dominant and leading, but I wouldn't do very well if I didn't have the left. And I think our body politic needs both sides as well. If I'm programmed to be a right eye, the right landscape is all I'm going to see. That's what I'm going to think truth is. But if I learn that there's a left side who sees a slightly different landscape, and we can adapt to each other, we can move forward with clarity and perspective and depth perception. And that's what I'd like to invite the panelists to do, to think about political conflict from that perspective. What does the other side see, and how can we adapt to each other, and where's the North Star? That's me, that's my introduction, and now I'm gonna give the stage to Nikki Dworkin. She and I met on Facebook. We discovered that we had very similar interests, and then COVID happened and Zoom meeting happened, and so we put this project together. Nikki.
Thank you, Alice. Hi, everybody. I got interested in this project because I've also been concerned about the increasing polarization, both within the psychoanalytic and psychotherapeutic community and in the world at large, concerned about extremes on both the right and the left, and interested in bridging those extremes. So welcome. I'm glad that all of you have decided to participate in this dialogue. It's likely that each of you have been affected differently by political divides. This dialogue is a time that you're welcome to speak about your experience and your views, as well as a time to commit to listening to each other's views with resilience, even when you hear something that might be upsetting. By speaking from the heart and listening deeply, we hope that you will understand each other better and learn something about each other that will contribute to strengthening relations among people with diverse political views. Let me tell you a little bit about the flow of the dialogue. You will begin by making some communication agreements for your time together. Then there will be a quick go around in which you introduce yourselves and say something about what you led to participate or what you hope to gain from being here. Next, we will have 3 rounds of opening questions that I will pose, and each of you will have an opportunity to respond to them in turn. Following that, you will have about half an hour for less structured conversation. We call this questions of genuine interest, and hope that you will explore connections between your experiences and perspectives and ask each other questions to learn more. You can also note similarities and differences in your views at this point, although, and this is important, without any attempt to convince others. Finally, you will have time at the end for each of you to say some closing words. We plan to end at 2 o'clock Eastern time. I'm going to do my best to make that happen. We have asked you to have some pens and paper available so you can jot down notes when you are hearing other people. This way you can return your full attention to listening. Your notes can also help you make connections in the second part of the dialogue. My role as facilitator is to guide you through the dialogue and ensure that the agreements you make with each other are followed or renegotiated. There will be times when you have time limits within which to respond to the questions. If you go over that time, I'll signal you with this signal. And that means you should wind up your thoughts by completing your sentence, not your paragraph. Finally, if at any point you have some concerns about how things are going, please let me know, and we will work together to figure out how to address them. Can I count on that?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Now we'll go on to the agreements. We have met before and created agreements together about how you will communicate in order to have the kind of conversation that results in greater learning and understanding of each other. The proposed agreements have been used by others to create a safe environment where people can speak from the heart and listen fully. Let's read them through one at a time and make sure they are clear and you are all willing to commit to them. Regarding the spirit of our speaking and listening, we will speak from ourselves and from our own experience. We will not criticize the views of other participants or attempt to convince them. We will listen with resilience when we hear something that is hard to hear. Regarding the form of our speaking and listening, we will participate within the time frames and share speaking time. We will not interrupt except to indicate we cannot hear a speaker, and we will pass if we don't wish to speak. Are there any questions about what any of these agreements mean?
They're good.
Great. So each of you is prepared to commit to these agreements as best as you can, and allow me to remind you if you slip or forget. Okay, then these will serve as your agreements. If at any point you feel these are not serving your purposes, speak up and we will see if it makes sense to revisit them. In order to promote contemplation and reflection, there will be some brief periods of silence in which to gather your thoughts before we begin speaking. I hope the audience watching can also take this time to reflect on the questions and notice any reactions you're having in your minds and bodies. Let's start by going around briefly, saying your name and either what brought you here or something that you hope to experience or learn while you are here. Rachel, could you please start us off?
Yes, thank you, Alice and Nikki, for inviting me to participate in this. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'm Rachel Fulton Brown. I'm an associate professor at the University of Chicago. I'm a historian, and particularly a historian of medieval Christianity. So most of my political conversations start from that position, and I'm very much hoping in our conversation that we can get to that deep level of understanding, not just the political.
Thank you. Shyam, could you please go next?
Sure. My name is Sean Campbell, and had the pleasure of knowing Alice for a number of years. Been involved in a lot of work in the mental health and substance abuse field, and now an attorney doing venture capital law. And I am looking forward to seeing a productive conversation that I hope can become a model for discussion and dialogue in other places, including universities. I think that would be a very productive outcome of today in terms of how we can move forward. So that's what I'm hoping for.
Thank you, Sean. Now we're going to move on to Sham. Your names are sort of similar, so I'll try to enunciate clearly so we don't get confused. Sham, could you please go next?
Sure, I appreciate it. I live in Chicago half the time, so people think my name is Irish anyway, so sure. So my name is Sham Sriram. I'm a visiting assistant professor of political science at Butler University in Indianapolis. And I met Nikki in Chicago, and she told me about this awesome opportunity. I specialize in American politics, particularly refugee resettlement and immigration. And I was definitely very interested as soon as she told me about it. What I hope to get out of this is actually turning this into something that I can implement in my own classrooms, and kind of thinking, as Sean said, about how we can use this model in the university setting.
Thank you, Sham. Valerie, I can't see your picture, but I'm imagining you right here on the lower left. Could you please go?
She's muted.
Sure. All right. I'm sorry about that. First of all, I apologize for your not being able to see my face. I am a Black woman, for those of you who can't tell. And I'm not being facetious. Some people really can't tell. So I'm a Black woman from North Lawndale. I am the owner of nonprofit Utopia, and we focus on working with nonprofits, helping them to build their capacity, but that's not why I'm here. The way I arrived, so to speak, is I'm a very engaged citizen in the North Lawndale community. That's ground zero for a number of our ills, and we'll talk about that in more detail. But I met Philip Cantor, who happens to be married to Nikki, and he introduced us and thought that I would be a good person to share views, given some of my interesting stances on issues, particularly around education. That's where he and I have met. But you know, if you live in a community like North Lawndale, everything is an issue, and you learn to fight a hydra-headed monster. So I'm here to have a civil discussion with people who may not necessarily see the world as I do. I find that that's very, very lacking. You know, I can remember when I was in college, you know, we could have civil and very, very passionate discussions and end up leaving loving each other, but that seems to be missing. So I'm hoping to, you know, learn more about what other people think and expand my own worldview.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Paul, could you please go next?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Wadey. I'm a psychotherapist. I work about 80 miles northeast of London, in Britain. As I was saying, I work with individuals and families. I've known Alice for around about 12 years. Online, we've spoken many times about the difficulties of discourse and the need to move from violence to discourse, and we have this greatly in common. I hope that this experiment, if I may call it that, is fruitful for us here. I hope that it's fruitful for those who listen to it and our audience members. And I hope it allows us to demonstrate to a great many people that models like this are facilitating environments which are extremely useful.
Thanks so much. Barry, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Barry Childress. I'm 80 years old. I've been retired for 6 years. I moved from Chicago, where I was born and raised, to Austin, Texas. I crossed paths with Nikki in the past, and she invited me because she thought I might be right-leaning and add something to the breadth of this problem with politics, which I see as a severe problem for our country. That's about it.
Thank you so much. So next I'm going to ask you all to tell a brief story. You're going to have 3 minutes from your personal life experience that will help other people better understand your views and concerns about our current political landscape. The pass agreement is in effect, and if you're not ready to speak, you can just say pass. After you have finished, I will come back to you and you can choose to speak then or keep your pass. Remember, you will not be responding to one another, but rather each of you will respond to this question. You may want to jot down some thoughts, connections, or ideas to explore later. I'm now going to give us all a couple minutes of silence to collect our thoughts. All right. Barry, would you mind starting us off with a personal story that you feel will help other people understand your views and your concerns about our political landscape?
All right. When you ask a child analyst about formative factors, you always begin at the beginning. And I have 2 starred events in my life. But I was born before Pearl Harbor. I had 2 close relatives in the Army. My parents were both loving, strict, and hardworking. My father had less than a full grammar school education. My mother finished high school. When I was in school on the west side of Chicago, I spent full summers on a farm in Indiana with my spiritual, hardworking grandmother. I spent a lot of time wandering the fields with my BB gun and dog. What's especially important for me now, looking back, is how much time I spent trying to see the world through the animals' eyes that we were raising. I was a Boy Scout, loving God and country. And high school was very hard for me because I had zoomed through grammar school and started high school in a brand new neighborhood, knowing no one at age 12, being 5'2" and 120 pounds. I got picked on. Sophomore year, I became more socially savvy, and I realized that some of the picking was teasing and playing, and I went along swimmingly from that point on. But the first year was hell. I was a member of CORE until they became an activist cause. College and medical school, no problem. One thing I did learn in college was perception is distorted by need. And that is a guiding principle that I've kept throughout my life. And fits right in with Sigmund Freud and transference. I married in medical school to a Lithuanian woman I met in college. Have 2 sons, 1 married, a Mexican female lawyer, and have 4 grandkids. Spent most of my time after training, camping, and motorhoming for 5 weeks every year in the United States. finally, an important thing for me to integrate all these things in my personal analysis, which I can't say enough about, but that's the sum of it.
Thank you so much, Barry. Paul, would you please go next?
Thank you. I'd like to share an experience that takes me back to being 16 years old, very poorly read, not really understanding much about the world. It was 1984, and Britain was in its 5th year of Margaret Thatcher coming into power. Some of you may have heard of her. The miners' strike took place, began in 1984 and lasted until 1985. During that time, the miners, their families, fought for their livelihoods. They were not fighting on clever economic grounds. They were fighting for their families, their communities, their towns, their cities. And there were fights. There was tremendous violence. Famously, one pitched battle between 6,000 police and 5,000 miners resulted in huge compensation for the miners and a certain amount of disgrace for the collected police forces who'd amassed at that particular colliery. A 16-year-old boy trying to make sense of the world encounters these things in the news and in the newspapers as a rather beguiling, rather confusing, rather ambivalent event. On the one hand, family members who may be conservative, and in my case, they were fairly conservative, would say things such as, well, what's the point in keeping a pit open if it's uneconomic? And yet something wasn't quite right within me. I felt very clearly that that was an economic question, which was a very serious and justified problem. But on the other hand, there were moral implications to families and communities. I found myself thus becoming politically minded. And I emerged from that situation as fortune would have it, a psychotherapist today. I don't know if there's a direct causal link. I wouldn't be so brave, but it's certainly a factor. So I've carried what was a 16-year-old's ambivalence, thank you, Nikki, and I have turned it into something else. And I think I'd like to share some of that something else.
Thank you so much, Paul. Valerie, could you please tell us a story from your life? Valerie?
Okay, got it. All right, what I have is not so much a story, but some things that shape my thinking today. I guess one is I was born in 1963 to parents who are from Mississippi, and they are very independent in their thinking. My dad, I know, grew up in a Republican family, and living in North Lawndale as a Republican in the 1950s and 60s was not exactly the most comfortable thing to do. And in those days, Republicans, especially in the South, tended to be much more progressive than the Southern Democrats. So he was very conservative in his leanings, but at that time, conservative didn't necessarily mean hateful. Fast forward to 1968, I can remember going shopping with my mom downtown, seeing a bunch of demonstrators actually scaling the Picasso statue. And I was asking her, well, what are they doing? And she says, oh, that's a demonstration. So that was kind of my first I guess, personal observation of what, I wouldn't call that a peaceful protest because the police got busy on the protesters. I can also remember being very intrigued with World War II stories as a sixth grader, going through, sixth to eighth grade, maybe even freshman year, and reading stories like Ceremony of Innocence and Diary of Anne Frank, and really getting a feel for what Nazism was and fascism was. And at that time, our country tended to have been anti-fascist, anti-Russian. We were very much in competition with the Russians. There was a Cold War. So all of that stuff kind of shaped my thinking, and it makes me feel today like I'm living in a twilight zone, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much. Rachel?
Well, I had been planning on telling a more recent story, but you all have made me thoughtful about the more distant past. So I was born in 1965, and therefore my memories go back to about the same time that you all have been talking about. The strongest memory I have from my childhood is the day my parents called us into their bedroom and my mother told us that my father was leaving. And I've thought a lot about that we were, me and my siblings were the first, forefront of the divorced kids, growing up in effectively a single parent family, although I was 11 when my dad left. My father had been, we'd moved around a fair amount. Barry's story about moving around resonates with me because one of the things that happened when we moved to Louisville, that was where we were living when my dad left, was getting beat up by the neighborhood kids and being, having to stand up to that. So I'd say my sense of being able to fight and to stand up clearly came out of that moment. But the sense of having no story that made sense anymore is the thing that I think I was left with most powerfully from that moment, that I had remembered before my parents told us that my dad was leaving, thinking how happy I was that my parents were not like that family down the block who, everybody, all the kids knew had gotten broken up. And I'm convinced that one of the things that made me become a historian was that inability to figure out what had happened. And I could obviously go into fairly great detail about how I tried to figure out different versions of the story of why dad left. He had an affair and his friends were incapable of convincing him to stay. But growing up, having to have both my father's story and my mother's story be equally true, and not be able to choose between them, we go visit dad and feel love for dad, come home and feel guilty for having enjoyed being there with him. That sense of never being able to know the true story, I think turned me into a historian, because I am now used to having constantly to revise the version of the past that I thought was real. And I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of how it affects our current political situation, because one, those of us who were going through the 70s are now the adults. And we have enough of us, I think, were affected by that divorce culture and the contraception culture and abortion becoming a norm now, that we are living with the psychic and spiritual consequences, and I'd say also theological consequences. So that's as much as my stories I think I can tell at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can you repeat her name, please? I can't see.
Oh, that was Rachel.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sham, could you please tell us a story from your past?
Sure. Going back to my childhood as well, can everyone hear me okay? Just checking.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Going back to my childhood, which, obviously informs so much of how we view the world. My parents dated in high school, and my father didn't graduate high school, but shortly after my mother got pregnant. And immediately, as if it wasn't even a thing they had to think about, they got married and decided that they were going to raise a nuclear family, which I think is beautiful, and definitely informed my pro-life views and my belief that marriage is something that is worthy of pursuing in our culture. But beyond that, I also recognize that there are many challenges. And by the time I was in high school, my father's bipolar disorder and alcoholism, which I almost don't even want to call it those things. I think there's just deeper struggles and deeper root cause issues that were manifesting that way. But that's what we focused on because, or at least we didn't even focus on it, but that's what when we were focusing on it, we're focusing on. But obviously led to a lot of holistic issues for our family, a lot of issues with criminal justice. My father was in and out of jail and ultimately prison. And with that came various economic consequences and all of those things. And coming of age of that, I found a lot of power in the possibility of capitalism and the possibility of entrepreneurship and creativity and ideas, and doing that all with supports and a lot of building social capital from strong communities, traveling, exposure to different ideas and cultures wherever possible, were all things that were tremendously supportive. And after my father passed away, really realizing that I needed something deeper than just success and accomplishments, but a spiritual underpinning that was grounded in, for me, Christian faith, but that the life of it wasn't just text or things that I could understand cognitively, but was the being of trying to find the balance and tension between grace and truth, trying to find humility, forgiveness, radical love, all of those things that we do some days better than others. But in terms of my political views, I got involved in a lot of work in human services, both in nonprofits and in government. And despite that, obviously, there were many kind and caring people doing that work. Broadly speaking, on a macro level, I didn't feel like we were trying to work ourselves out of a job. We were spending a lot of money in ways that may not have been so effective, and that will be the start of some of my political evolution to a right of center perspective. But we'll save that for another time.
Thank you so much, Sean. And now, Sham,
Thank you.
could you please go next?
Sure. So I have again, I've been inspired by my colleagues here to reflect on childhood. So I'm the first person in my family born in America, and that definitely has a huge influence on the kind of person I've become. But a great story is when I was about 9, we all moved back to India, where my parents had emigrated from in the 1970s, and I lived in India from 9 to 17, or 5th to 12th standard or grade. And when I was in high school in India, I was in my school library, and I pulled this book from the shelf, and it was Battle Cry by Leon Euris. And I had no idea who Leon Euris was. My friend Deja was like, "Oh, you'll love his books." I read Battle Cry. I'm completely enamored by his experiences in the Marines in World War II. Then I read Exodus, Mila 18 about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Then I read Chaim Potok, Cynthia Ozick, Joseph Heller, and I become enamored by Jewish American fiction. So much so that I wrote to Euris and he wrote back. It's in my office. It's my most prized possession, is this letter from him. And the reason I'm telling the story is I became infatuated with the stories of American Jews. So much so, even though I'm this Tamil Brahmin kid, but when I went to college at Purdue, I did a minor in Jewish studies. And I took Hebrew, and I took all these courses. I'm actually teaching a course this fall at Butler on Jewish voices, right? And the reason I'm sharing all of this is to say that what happened was I was a senior in college. I'm taking all these courses. I become very enamored with Jewish American politics. And I was writing a paper on Black Jewish relations following something called the Crown Heights riots when David Dinkins was mayor of New York. And my professor at Purdue, Robert Melson, I'm still very close to, I was in his office and he said, "Sham, is it possible the reason you're exploring this topic is because you're trying to figure out your story?" Until that moment, I didn't even think that that's what was happening, because I didn't even know there was a field called Asian American politics or Asian American studies. So it was that conversation in his office 18, 19 years ago that set me on this path of studying immigration and realizing that my lived experience could become my occupation. And it all started with reading a Leon Euris book in my school library in Chennai, which used to be called Madras, in 1993. And this is where I am.
Thank you so much. We are now going to move on to the next question. You will have up to 2 minutes to respond to the second question. What is the core issue for you when you think about our current political divides? You will have 2 minutes to reflect before we begin. Actually, I'm going to change that to 1 minute, 30 seconds for the sake of time before we begin. So what is the core issue for you when you think about our current political divides? Sham, could you please start us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you for this great question. The core issue that I reflect on all the time now, that I think is indicative of who we are and what we have become, is US policies towards refugees. And the reason I share that specific point is, from 2008 to 2014, I was a professor at Georgia Perimeter College in Clarkston. Clarkston is 9 miles east of Atlanta, and it is where all refugees are resettled when they first move to Georgia. So the student body at that college was incredibly diverse, and I became very passionate about refugee-related issues. So now to see where we are, fallen so far with the number of refugees the US has taken is at the lowest ever. To see also the legacy tarnish of Presidents Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. and even Gerald Ford was more open-minded about refugees than where we are right now. So I think it's a tremendous loss of our culture as America that the word refugee now in the US since 2015-16 has become synonymous with terrorism, with criminality, somehow with something that takes away our sovereignty as Americans. And I don't understand it at all, because the roots of our refugee policy go back to the Holocaust, and then the Cold War, and subsequent generations of refugees who have come to the US from so many countries that had nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with even being Muslim. And yet we're in a place now where refugees around the world suffering because the US has dropped the ceiling to take in refugees from 50,000 to 30,000 to 20,000. And I think in our current state, there's going to be no refugee policy very soon. And I think it just speaks of how far we have fallen as a country. So as the movie recently went, Olympus truly has fallen.
Thank you. Rachel, could you please go next and tell us what you think is the most crucial issue?
For me, the most crucial issue is the loss of understanding of history. And I'm glad to have the opportunity with thinking about our personal stories to say why I study it. I think we don't understand ourselves unless we're able to tell sort of full and complex stories. And the more that we turn into a country that, you know, vilifies people from previous generations for not being ourselves now, the more we don't understand our parents, we don't understand our grandparents, we don't understand who we are, that turns into a political issue for me is one, that history is the way in which the country defines itself, mythologically and philosophically and theologically. And, the degree to which we are trapped in this, this erasure of history right now, to me is the most terrifying political moment, that you are being told that to describe a story from different perspectives is evil and hateful, rather than recognizing that nobody tells their own story. Everybody's orthodox to himself. Nobody tells their own story as the villains and the bad guys, and yet we seem to have gotten to a place where there's in fact, a nation only exists when we have a story that we agree on, but we're fighting in ways that you can never come to an appreciation of why there might be conflicting stories. And I go back to my, my parents' divorce in those terms. I think the polarization that I see, we tend to say things that are left and right. I think, they're deeper divisions, that we're talking in either masculine and feminine terms, or we're talking in numerical and verbal terms. That one of the things that I think is most difficult for us at the present is not having a sense that there's more than just the left and right that came out of the French Revolution as the political divisions. That they're much deeper divisions. That an example of the irony I think we're caught up in right now is the way in which people in Portland are talking about secession, and that they don't want the federal government sending in troops. Well, that was the South's argument back when we were deciding whether or not there was going to be a union to start with. And if you can't even be able to talk about those issues without it being predetermined who was right, then you don't understand the complexities of the decisions that we have to make right now.
Thank you. Paul, could you please go next?
Okay, so when I think about the core issue, I'm drawn to the notion of fear. Fear is the thing which arrives after appetite. It seems to me that the origin of human experience is one based on appetites, as the ancients told us. But then after that, our first experience of dependency, isolation, alienation is one of fear. It seems to me that it's the origin and the most enduring experience. Now that experience, if it is, as I'm contesting, one of the origination points of what it is to be human, is going to show itself at every opportunity where there are triggers, where there are threats, where there are, if you will, survivalistic situations. And perhaps when we think of something as architectonic, as left and right politics, we are straight away, I think, confronted with the question of, well, who is immune to fear? And the answer quickly comes back, none of us. It seems to me, therefore, that the core problem, if I can put it this way, is fear and its associated expressions, anxiety, anger, frustration, and the raft of emotions that we understand. And I'm suggesting, like some other interesting people, much more interesting than me, that fear is the origination point of these problems.
Thank you, Paul. Valerie, what do you think is the core issue for you with politics right now?
Oh, it's so funny. If you'd asked me that 4 years ago, I would say education. One of the big divides was charter schools versus public schools. And I was very much on the side of traditional public schools for a number of reasons. But fast forward to now, to me, it feels that the core issue boils down to freedoms. It seems to me that the powers that be, regardless of whether they're Democrats or Republicans, you know, because I've seen it on both sides of the issue, and I want to be clear that I'm neither Democrat nor Republican, but I would classify myself as more progressive in my thoughts and independent in my thought. But it just seems to me that the powers that be are capitalizing on things like COVID-19, the drastic turn for the worse in our economy, to make us fearful and voluntarily give up our freedoms. But at the same time, we have to balance those freedoms with common sense and wisdom. You know, there are people who don't want to wear masks, you know, because of COVID-19, because they want to have the freedom to not wear the mask. But then where their freedom ends, mine begins. You know, I like to have the freedom to not have to catch COVID-19 from other people. So it's, for me, you know, the fact that our president and others in leadership are coming down on us in terms of the COVID-19 issue, telling us we don't have to wear masks, which I think is kind of oppressive. Also, the fact that we have police, and even to a degree, we have some organizations that tend to want to stifle public expression. So it's not just the police forcefully telling protesters to go home. It's subtly creeping into our day-to-day conversations. People on both sides are just not tolerant, and rather than have good discourse, they try to shut people down. And I've literally had a group of community nonprofits sick a lawyer on me because I asked innocent, well, I wouldn't say innocent, but I asked reasonable questions that they didn't want to answer. They had an attorney to send me a cease and desist letter so I wouldn't ask questions that were very pertinent and reasonable, and they weren't necessarily of a confidential nature. And when you get to that point, you know, I think we've really lost it. And powers that be could be the White House, it could be local elected officials, it could be people who are in positions of power at the community level.
Thank you, Valerie. Barry, could you please tell us what you think the core issue is for you?
For me, it's politicians. I tend to be more Republican than Democrat, but I really do not like professional politicians. I see them as self-serving and divisive and creators or benefiters of the social divide. I think they specialize in identity politics, and that brings us into more either or binary positions where there is no discussion. An additional factor, I think, is the media. And some politicians make their living getting reelected and self-benefit from that. And I think that describes much of our media today. I mean, I don't watch it anymore. I don't see facts anymore. I see public opinion. I see op-ed pieces, and I hear statistics being skewed one way or the other. And I think the benefit of for the media is to keep us scared. They want us to stay tuned. And so I don't like politicians. I don't like media. And I think they are our core issues. Different than whether somebody has big government or little government interests. So the people are fine. It's the professionals that I have trouble with.
Thank you, Barry. And finally, Sean, could you tell us how you see the core issue?
Sure, I think it goes again to root cause issues of trauma and ego. I think when we think about trauma that somebody may experience, whether on a micro level or macro level, or something through, generational inheritance, perhaps, as we explore that, trauma, an experience where fear puts us in a state of helplessness for a period of time, has impacts on our neurobiology and changes the way our amygdala works and changes the way our hippocampus works and changes our ability to emotionally regulate. And I think without addressing trauma in a sometimes a clinical sense and sometimes a spiritual sense, or both, ego and identity politics very readily form. Individuals form egos out of trauma. Organizations form egos out of collective groups of people. Governments, nations, religions, and this goes on and on. So I think that we need healing, and that's where we start. If we figure out ways that we can help people heal trauma, and we can cognitively understand, best practices and how we want to treat one another, but there's a difference between what our left brain cognitively understands and the way that our right brain can implicitly process and execute on these things. And until we address that, we're going to be we're always going to have the original. When I think of original sin, I think of that as ego, which we're always going to have it because we need it to survive. But if we don't address it on some level, it may kill us all as a species. So, I hope we can address trauma and then ego, and then I think a lot of these things will start to take care of themselves. So that's where I would prioritize.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to read the third question. You will have a minute and a half to reflect on it, and then each of you will speak for up to 2 minutes in response. When you think about your political commitments, are there any aspects of these issues that are complicated for you? Do you have any mixed feelings, or sometimes feel torn in different directions? We're going to take about a minute or so of silence to think about that. This time, anyone can begin, and you can respond in whatever order, like popcorn. So when you're ready to pop up, you can speak.
I'd like to start.
Thank you.
No problem. There's two issues that I am always torn about, and I feel conflicting emotions for. The first is affirmative action. the liberal position that everyone has to endorse affirmative action, I can't support it because for me, from my perspective, is that I feel like any discussion of affirmative action, and again, I'm taking this in a deeper context about nuance, as Rachel was pointing to. It's not black or white. We have to go deeper. Is that I understand the historical basis for affirmative action, Lyndon Johnson, Civil Rights Act. I get all of this. But in the terms of affirmative action in the current context, as an Asian American, it's a very complex issue. My problem with affirmative action or the narrative around it is that I don't want to think that I have achieved what I have in my life because I'm a minority. I want to know that I've achieved what I've had in my life because of merit. And in fact, when I did my first master's degree at Georgia State University in Atlanta, I had someone come up to me and we were talking, and I remember now this person said, "Isn't it great you got in because of affirmative action?" And it was like being kicked in the neck. Like I told this person, I said, "No, I got in because whatever." They're like, "No, you got in because it's a minority quota." I said, "That doesn't make sense because that particular university had a majority minority situation. There's a huge African American student population because it's in downtown Atlanta and Fulton County." So I really bristled with that idea that I was in because I checked a box, not because of what I could contribute as a scholar. So that's one issue I feel torn about, and I feel like I can't necessarily take the liberal position. And the other one is support for veterans. First of all, like I actually wanted to join the military. I took the armed forces test when I was 33, scored a 95, but I was either too old for some branches or had too many tattoos for the others. So I couldn't do it. So it really pains me when I hear Democrats, like, of course, there are people like Tammy Duckworth and other people, but like to hear people or liberals knock the military or knock veterans, I can't get behind that. But on the other hand, if being pro-military or pro-veteran makes people minimize other people's accomplishments or make it all about rah, 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 I can't go that way either, right? So this is one of those issues I feel kind of torn because I feel proud to be an American, proud of our military, but I don't want to seek that pride with groups of people who use pride as a way to exclude. So.
Okay, can I dovetail off of that?
Absolutely.
Okay, this is Valerie. Actually, affirmative action was started by the Republicans under Nixon. So that was a political move, and I think that people try to use affirmative action to make you feel or make us feel exactly what you are feeling. And don't get me wrong, sometimes I feel like that as a Black woman. I'm constantly challenged, about how I got someplace, right? But I'm fortunate in some ways that I was raised by parents who always told me, and Black folks of a certain age know what I'm talking about. If you're Black, you have to be twice as good to get half as far as a white person. So I've always had that kind of energy underneath my wings. But my biggest problem right now that I feel conflicted with is the fact that there's a push for police being defunded and taken out of our schools. Coming from a community like North Lawndale, born and raised there, it has always been, all of my life, it's always been marginalized. But we had at one point a good buddy neighbor system where we looked out for each other, and our neighbors really kept the community safe. If they saw something, they'd say something. Now we're in a situation where, if you say something, you're putting your life at risk. So you've got on both sides with the police as well as the citizenry, this code of silence. So a lot of stuff just happens. And at the same time, we're saying that we don't want the police. We want it both ways. We say that the police are brutal. They're not our friends. They need to be out of the community. And then if we call 311, we get mad because the police doesn't respond. And then when they do respond, we're saying it's too much force. And then I'm seeing even, in the government levels, there seems to be a very liberal view of crime and law enforcement and how we deal with it. And don't get me wrong, God knows I believe in restorative justice, but it seems to me that some of the wrong people are the candidates for this lenience, and then you have innocent people who are still locked up. I don't know what the answer is, but that's something that tears me apart.
Thank you, Valerie.
Right.
I can say a few things, but it's not attached to the previous speakers'
That's
comments.
just things that have pull you in different directions.
All right. In my politics, which are based on my personal values, so that I can go either way. I tend to go conservative because that's my nature. But in terms of things that get pulled in me as a person and as a professional analyst is the relationship between feelings and facts. and back to my perception is distorted by need. I am at a loss for some of the things that people do and say based almost solely on feeling. I would tell patients that feelings are one way to look at the world, but you have other resources like facts, like intellect, like how you assess in a situation, not just a rebound triggered personal feeling. So that's what divides me. Otherwise, my political views are fairly solid.
So I realize, this is great because I constantly want to respond to everybody who's spoken before, but I know I'm supposed to talk about myself. I realize, I'm going to keep going back to my saying I'm a historian, and I realize the biggest struggle I have is which story to be proud of. And I'll say that my dad will recur constantly in my thinking. Is he was very, very proud to be American. He was very proud to be Scots-Irish Presbyterian. He was very proud to be a veteran. My grandfather was a 2-star general, having served in the Air Force his entire career. And I went to study in England when I was a graduate student, and of course found people this mid-80s who were definitely not proud to be, did not like me as an American and did not want me to be proud as an American because we were responsible for all the evil in the world. And so I think some of what I realized I've been trying to do in this political journey I've been on is figuring out which strand of the story I get to be proud of, right? Is it the American, say the Federalist, the Constitutionalist? Is it the Presbyterian part? Is it the, what I ground out in is I'm Christian. And what I've learned in the past few years of reading is I'm not sure I can be proud of most of the things that I thought I was supposed to be proud of. The Presbyterians, that, well, we can bracket that, but the capitalism problem is huge, right? I was pleased that we're in a panel of people who, start businesses and think about entrepreneurship and creativity and such, because I think that, as a Christian, my core faith is we're made in the image and likeness of a maker, and we are called to make things, art and machines and cities and cultures and selves through training ourselves in virtue. But at what point does that become corrupt and evil? And I did a lot of reading for a few years ago in Deirdre McCloskey's books on capitalism, and she was finding a place to be proud in capitalism from the Anglo-Dutch experience of training in what she called habits of lip, the rhetoric, that's speaking about the goodness of making and you know, production and so forth. But I keep reading deeper back into it, and now I understand that a good part of English capitalism, which is therefore the modern world that we're living in, the sort of American empire, is grounded in usury and therefore fundamentally evil, and that what we're experiencing right now in the sort of political explosion is the bursting of the debt bubble. I don't know enough economics to know whether any of this is accurate, true. I've read lots of Thomas Sowell. I tried reading and I really dislike not having a ground of truth, right? And I think that my sense of, if I can just read enough history, I'll find the deep story, I'll find all of the right strands, I'll know all of the unintended consequences of the systems and institutions that we've built up over the centuries. That sort of radical instability, I can be sort of politically on lots of different sides because I'm recognizing constantly the unintended consequences of the systems that we've been living in. But I God help me, I hope I still ground out at the cross every single time, because I don't see how we can exist as a community or as souls without some grounding in truth. And I'd say that's my greatest anxiety, right? Are we capable of finding a truth that can actually give us an anchor and something to build off of?
Thank you.
Next. So, and I'll go here, but in a way that hopefully doesn't, I think this conversation often yields ego, and I try to have it in a different way. So I'm a registered Republican. I'm a church-going Christian. I'm proud of, I try not to say pride because that's not something I want to have, but I'm grateful for those things, and I see no reason that I would change either of those things. But obviously for me personally, the biggest challenge of being a Republican right now is the president, who's somebody I didn't vote for in 2016. I wrote in somebody's name, and I will write in a name again in 2020, and without making it about him, because I try not to do that. I'm always, one of my favorite, even though this is just a quote of a Bible verse, one of my favorite things is being quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger, from the disciple James in his letter in the New Testament. And I long for leadership that can do that. For me, I think like George H.W. Bush was an example of a leader that was able to do that in terms of navigating the end of the Cold War and addressing some other issues, regardless of political party. Jimmy Carter's spirit of evangelism is the kind that I personally try to model. And so I think the challenge is being a registered Republican and feeling confident about that. I have no shame in that. And I plan to try to see greater ideals in those conservative principles that I do believe in. But it's sometimes a lonely time. So I'm hoping that we can just continue to compete in the marketplace of ideas and put forth ideas and I guess reimagine a conservative vision moving forward.
So, may I go next?
You're the last one.
Oh, okay. That's probably a good idea. But... So I'm going to repeat the question back to myself so that I'm fresh with it. So when I think about political commitments, are there aspects of these issues that are complicated for me? Do I have mixed feelings? Or am I torn in different directions? So I think that from my point of view, commitments are based on a trueness to self, a trueness to family, and a trueness to our work or endeavors, whatever those endeavors are. In plainer language, I think those are horizontal and concerned with morals. I think that there are commitments to the social and there are commitments to reason. Taking the point made by, I believe, Barry, this idea of the of Plato's two horses, reason and emotion, is an interesting one. It seems to me that we're trying to steer that chariot in approximately one direction rather than finding half a chariot one side of the road and half a chariot on the other. Now, the complication, from my perspective, is how do we take discourse as an ethical pursuit, as something that seeks consensus, is based on reason, and it moves, instead of horizontally, how do we take it vertically? I'm reminded of a conversation with Shyam that he mentioned Habermas, and I was delighted when he mentioned Habermas, because I think discourse ethics is something that we need to familiarize people with. It's something we need to make digestible. If I say Habermas to my milkman, I don't have a milkman, but if I said Habermas to my milkman or my dustman, he's going to say, that's lovely. What on earth is that? Is that a cake? So taking the rather, and let's own it, I think, taking the rather elite perspective that we all have here into account, making things like discourse ethics digestible for anybody is about moving it into the public sphere, which I think this enterprise actually has some legs, as far as I can see. And it's about explaining to people that you can create, I believe this, these are my beliefs, I believe that we can create facilitating environments where discourse is privileged, where it is based on reason, where it is based on consensus, where it is based on an acceptance that I can sit with the disagreeable and the uncomfortable in order to move out of the simple binary opposition. A against B, black against white, man against woman, this against this, the either orness or the all or nothingness that I referred to earlier as architectonic is simply a waste of energy. The whole point, it seems to me, about mixed feelings is that although they're uncomfortable, we can turn them into something else if there's a facilitating environment. In a good family, there is dispute. In a good workplace, there is constructive dispute. In a good institution, we can dispute things in a mature way and we can go somewhere with it. And it's that going somewhere with it that might be a really good idea if we can show people how to do that. And that's called discourse ethics.
Paul,
Now, what do I mean by facilitating? Have I said too much?
yes, you're out of time, but that was such a great segue into our next section, which is the questions of genuine interest section, because we are now, uh-oh, did we lose somebody? We lost Barry.
Oh, he's still there.
I'm still here. I just got low back.
You're still here. I can't see you, but that's okay. We are now at the point that you will be able to talk more freely. It's important to remember why you are here, not to debate or convince, but to speak from your heart, to listen with open hearts, to reflect on your own views, and try your best to understand others' views. This is a time to make connections between what is on your mind and something others have said. You can ask a question, pursue a theme, explore similarities and differences, or comment on what you have heard. You may ask a question. Is there something someone said that you'd like to understand better? Note a point of learning. Have you heard something that stirred fresh thoughts or feelings? Add a thought. Has an interesting theme or idea emerged that you would like to add to? Or clarify differences. Have you heard something you disagreed with? If so, first check that you've understood it correctly, and then say what was distressing to you and why. I'm going to give you about a minute to think of a question or a point that you'd like to ask another individual or to the whole group.
Can you see me now?
I can see you again, Barry. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take a bathroom break for a minute.
Okay, you can do that during our minute of silence.
You should probably mute your device.
Yeah, don't take it with you.
Oh my goodness.
No, but for the grace.
And I'm gonna run and put my wedding ring on because I left it upstairs and it's bothering me that it's not on. So I'll be back in 30 seconds.
All right. I guess people might need a short break. So if you need a minute, you can
See
do
what
that in
happens when you
silence.
mention Habermas?
Everybody runs away.
Everybody runs.
I'm still here. You can't
Could
see
be-
me, but I'm here.
It could be worse, Paul. I was going to bring up Deleuze and Qatari.
Hey,
Okay, let's name drop.
Yeah.
Right. This has to be silence. I'm gonna give you all 30 more seconds and then you can name drop. Oh, good. So everybody is back. That's great. So whoever would like to bring up a question at a point, please feel free.
Okay, I'll try to be controversial, I suppose. Well, no, because I'm thinking, I mean, everything we've talked about makes so much sense and I agree with, and, you know, including that we should figure out ways to help the milkmen understand why we would talk about Habermas. I think one of the things that I think academia tends to ground out in and that we don't know how to deal with is what I was pointing to, saying that I am in search of the truth, right? Capital T truth. I believe it must be out there, otherwise we can't think. But most of our models of conversation are open, right? They're indeterminate, and you know, what Paul was saying about, you know, families are going to have disputes, but there has to be something the family agrees on, like staying a family, which clearly my parents weren't able to do. So how do we, you know, I think we came together as this group to have this conversation with some certain kinds of agreements that I think have made us able to have this conversation. But how are we going to have a society if we don't have core agreements? And as a Christian, I know what I think they should be, but that, I mean, that's really difficult. And I think for me, that's been, interestingly, the hardest thing in the sort of public sphere conversations, that when I say it grounds out to a theological question, it grounds to what do we think of as truth?
may I respond?
Yes, anyone can respond at this point.
I like that way of thinking a great deal. And it reminds me of the fairly conservative religious background that I emerged from, Anglican. And it seems to me that it might actually locate the problem in a way that makes it very difficult to negotiate. And this is what I mean by that. That core truth or absolute truth, if there is such a thing, and I believe that there might well be, certainly in terms of knowledge, if it exists at our very center, then center-to-center communication is going to be extremely difficult, nigh on impossible. It seems to me that what we're negotiating is the overlap. What we're negotiating is what we have in common, not what are my most privileged truths. And so I would suggest that our most privileged truths aren't necessarily a good starting point. Discuss.
Disagree.
Go ahead, Sean.
I think that there almost then becomes a paradox between truth and liberty / freedom. I think we've seen societies try to impose their view of truth, which I guess isn't the truth. The view of truth, I guess that's a whole philosophical thing, but we've seen that in various societies that have, let's say, imposed a religion or imposed the absence of religion. I think, and maybe this is an American or Western democratic point of view, but I think that tolerance is the ideal. I think acceptance goes too far, because I don't think acceptance is sustainable, because then we're always fighting over the truth. But tolerance requires us to, I mean, sometimes people, some of my progressive friends don't like the word tolerance now. So when they tell me that, I just substitute it with respect. The idea that, even though to me they're the same thing, but the idea that that's maybe the best we can do if we can just, and from a Christian perspective, that I also think translates into other faiths and people who don't practice a particular religion, the idea of love, if we can do that on a bold and consistent scale, we can love even if we don't like. And I just think that's the best we can do. I don't know how to go further as a species. So that's all I have to offer on that.
So something that has been coming to mind from all of these points is, and there's a political debate going on about this right now, but I feel like it connects to everything. And what Sean just said about, liberty, freedom, truth is really speaking to me. And that is this current debate about the New York Times 1619 project. And the reason why I think it's important is, and this ties exactly to what Rachel brought up, and I wrote it down when she earlier talked about the erasure of history. So the question that I was going to ask her, but now it ties into everything, is what is the difference between erasure and revisionism? Because the 1619 project debate is at the core of this, right? Which is, who gets to tell America's story? And I'm now part of a cohort of professors at Butler that is designing the very first Asian American studies course ever in the history of the university. But part of that is looking at empire and exclusion and who gets to tell, like, why are so many Asian stories in the Americas not told, or that part of history? So then it's like this question of, we have to tell the stories that of the people who didn't get a chance to tell it. And I think that kind of ties into what Sean said when I love this quote, I don't think acceptance is sustainable, right? But like, I also agree that liberals have a very poor understanding of tolerance, right? Like that they have defined what it means to be tolerant. And if you are somehow outside of that box, you are deemed intolerant. And I 100% agree with you that religious conservatives, whether Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, can probably all agree with that. So anyway, I think I'm bringing up a couple different points, but I'll just say that I think right now in America, there's this debate over who gets to tell America's story. And I think it goes down to the work of Roger Smith and Desmond King, who wrote a book called A House Divided. And they said America has two groups, right? One group believes that America should be colorblind, and the other group says that we can't be colorblind because race grounds everything. And I think it's those two groups, right? One group that says we don't see color, and another group says you can't not see color. That tension is really driving a lot of the discussion right now. So.
It's interesting that you talk about colorblind. I can remember the city of Chicago enacted a quote unquote colorblind system for magnet school and selective enrollment school enrollment. And, before they even introduced it or before they approved it, I could see that a colorblind system where you're based on census tracts and not quote unquote race would actually end up with the result that would appear more racist than if you actually took race into account. So it's interesting. I really do believe that race needs to be taken into account for cases where there's a lack of equity. And sometimes in dealing with color blindness, we end up with more homogeneity than we did from the start. And all you have to do is look at the admissions numbers before and after that policy. And it, you know, it turned out just like we thought it would. But the city of Chicago didn't care. You know, they didn't care to listen. They just did what they did what they do. So that's one thing that I think about. And then two, I think America seems to have lost its set of core values. At least nobody seems to be focusing on the core values. You know, liberty and justice for all. Give me your tired, your poor, the huddled masses, and all of that good stuff. You know, the great American melting pot. You know, all men were created equal. It seems that folks in power now are, you know, their value system is totally disconnected with what this country, at least what I read this country was founded upon. And until there's some arbiter of the truth, we're just going to see more confusion, in my humble opinion.
Barry, you have to unmute yourself. Still muted. There you go.
All right. You know, I think we have a good guideline for that was given to us that we are attacking, and that is our Constitution. What I love civics, and I love reading the Constitution. And the Constitution is a unique charter, if you will, because what it does is it limits the power of government, and it enhances the power of the individual and protects them from government. I see that violated all the time. Do I have to wear a mask? Do I have to stay inside? Do I have, you know, we have freedoms, and our freedoms end when they encroach on somebody else's freedoms. But it's hard to, with the legal divides and the arguments, and forgive me if anybody's a lawyer, but there was a town that had one lawyer and he was going broke, and then another lawyer moved into town and they both got rich. That's all I have to say.
So can I respond to the who gets to tell the story question?
Sure.
Yeah. So this is my example of why I used to be proud of being Scots-Irish, which I still am, but now I'm conflicted. Actually, I'm more proud because Mary Queen of Scots should have been Queen of England, but the Protestant witch had her executed. And no, and the thing is, the deep history of the United States, and we say, you know, the Constitution is our bedrock, but it's a revolutionary document in the sense that they were throwing off their recognized king. But on the other hand, they'd already done that in 1538 when they burned all the statues of Christ and his mother. That one of the very interesting ways that, you know, the history of the United States could be retold is as a conflict between the English Empire and the Spanish Empire, between the Protestants and the Catholics. And if you go back to, you know, our refugee policy and our immigration, I grew up in a number of different parts of the country, but the one that I have my deepest memories of is Albuquerque, which Santa Fe is as old as Jamestown. And the Spanish Empire was here just as long as the English. And it's always been interesting to me that we privilege, you can say, a Whig history version and New England, the damn Yankees version, over the real complexity of how, in fact, that eastern seaboard extended its empire over the rest of the continent, which would then involve, you know, do you tell the story from the perspective of the people who were living here already and who were the hostile enemies of the United States for many hundreds of years, and then they were militarily defeated and their descendants now live on reservations. I mean, saying, that we never had to invade. Yes, we did, the settlers may be one kind of argument, but that there's the multiplicity of American histories that, I don't think the 1619 project is neutral, but I don't think any history telling is neutral. And indeed, from what location are you telling the story? Are you telling the story from the perspective of the Spanish Empire, who, was defeated in a number of battles over the course of the 19th century, so that we have the states of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. There's also, the religious conversation of the degree to which Protestantism supports a particular kind of economic system. And that's kind of where my reading is right now. And I'm terribly conflicted, because it means even the things that I thought were good about capitalism were possibly founded on theological errors and are therefore intrinsically evil. And, my response as a scholar and my response as a Christian is read more history. But, the question who tells the story is absolutely critical, because you are always, the storytellers get to be the heroes of their own narrative, typically. I really could go on that, but I'll stop.
Perception is distorted by need.
Well, the thing is it wrong to be the heroes of the story that you're telling, right? I think that's another problem.
It's not a problem, it's just egoic.
As long as it's not propaganda, then who defines propaganda?
New York Times.
No, I was going to say Mad Magazine, actually. Alfred E. Neuman. That's it.
Oh my goodness.
I could jump in with a few thoughts if that's okay. Yeah.
Yep, go ahead.
So, thank you. So just to tie on a few themes, I figured I'd throw my thoughts in. So my wife is in the US Navy here and is originally from Ghana and came here when she was 18. And so we have a 3.5-month-old daughter. And so a lot of things in current events have been on my mind lately from different perspectives. One thing that touches on the color blindness question and the affirmative action question and things like that, and even I'll touch on school choice, is just from I guess my perspective and maybe to my family's perspective, though I'll just speak from myself. When we visit Ghana, and I've been to the castles where Africans 300-400 years ago were captured, and you walk through the dungeons where many died, and literally right above them are Protestant churches where people prayed, above where the people who were going to be labor of capitalism were underneath, and we're Protestants, and we believe in capitalism and all of these things in terms of I believe in capitalism for what it has done for many people. And I feel like we've only used 10% of capitalism's good potential. And so I'm really interested to see what's possible when we tap into it at its fullest. But as far as the castles in Ghana, it really makes me reflect on the idea of race as a social construct, which mirrors my more liberal friends and what they say. But I also see it as something that was invented out of sin to create power over other people. And change, instead of seeing each other the way God sees each of us, we started to see each other differently. And ultimately, where we have to go is, I think, ultimately to a place of colorblindness. Because of things that have happened, we may still at times have to talk about race to some extent. Depending on the issue, I feel differently at different times, but I also have a nephew, but through my wife's side of the family, who's 11 years old, and they live in Aurora, Colorado, where Elijah McClain was killed last year. And the fact that those officers are back on the street does make me a bit unsettled. And you know, I appreciate law enforcement. I don't want to group everybody together, but yes, that on a personal level in that town does provide a bit of unsettlement. I'll also say that, you know, having a Christian background, my sister-in-law, I think would love to send her son to a Christian school, but that option isn't available just because school vouchers don't exist in that state. She has been able to send him to a charter school, which was her preference, and I really think that part of liberty is providing those resources where we shift power into the hands of individuals to have that purchasing power, so to speak, to make choices that personally best fit their individual needs in the marketplace. And then as far as, and I'll just quickly touch on this last thing, I have a list in the 1619 project and the public square and the statues and all that. I think it becomes a question of what's history and what's the public square. So, you know, my wife being in the Navy, we're in Virginia, we've been to the Confederate History Museum, the American Civil War Museum, several Civil War battlefields, Appomattox, all that's history. There's a difference between going into town and like, do I want my daughter seeing a statue of a Confederate general? If it was Thomas Jefferson, it's one thing because there's many other ideals there in addition to the fact that he owned slaves. So I can look at the complexity of that. I don't know if I feel the same, you know, affinity towards maybe somebody whose only legacy publicly was a Confederate general. So I think there's nuance there to discuss, but I threw a lot out there. Those are my thoughts.
And my question to you is, what happened to all the compassionate conservatives? They seem to have just gone into silence.
I'm for them too, but yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. I'm trying.
Right. Because I always see now, or I put like this, all I see, I can't speak for others, all I see now is the hatred and cruelty and people assigning conservatism to, you know, to mean the same thing as racism, but that's not.
Part of it is our branding. I think we need to rebrand a little bit and go back to some compassionate conservatism.
Okay, I'm going to tie it back to what Barry said, which is the media, social media particularly. Like, I think the problem, Valerie, and right now is that the voices that we're hearing are the extremes on both sides. And they are using Twitter. Facebook is the island of misfit toys. Facebook is like the Lord of the Flies every day. Like everyone starts to out troll each other. And then in the end, Piggy is the one who dies because he has glasses. But I'm just saying is.
Facebook's tame compared to some other places.
No, I know. We haven't even talked about 4chan, right? But I'm just, the point I'm making is that we're not seeing like the true heart of America, whether it's our media or social media, whatever. And again, this whole thing has been so amazing because if this kind of conversation could be amplified over and over again, repeated, I think we get to see those people. We don't get to see those voices. What we see publicly is such a small percentage of who Americans are. Like, again, I mentioned Ronald Reagan before, and Reagan's refugee policies incredible, but I'll just reference him again in that, you know, again, Reagan is a figure for me that I have all sorts of things. He's a great president, but then I just been doing a lot of work now recently, for example, on how, you know, comparing COVID and AIDS in terms of the public response as a moral panic, using the work of Stanley Cohen from England and Moral Panic and Folk Devils. But I love parts of Reagan. I love in his first inaugural, when he said, people who say we don't have enough heroes don't know where to look, right? It's an iconic statement, but he's also the president who I associate with not responding to AIDS quickly till Rock Hudson died, and then it changed things in the US. So I'm just making the point that there's so much nuance to everything. We have to focus on maybe the statements of people and their words, like going to the source of it and just kind of filtering out social media. Twitter, for sure. Twitter is hardly representative of the American populace. But I think actually engaging with people, talking to people, because I really, at the end of the day, believe that most Americans are kind. I've been to 48 out of the 50 states. Like, most people are kind. And hello, thank you, sir, ma'am goes a long way.
Yeah. Can I jump in? I see that the conversation, it's hardly surprising, I see that the conversation is using more of a microscopic view of history. But we're talking about American history, I believe, and I believe that, you know, the idea that you would focus on purely interpretations of liberalism, libertarianism, individual presidents, is a wider lens, and I'd like to introduce that lens. I'd like to, I suppose, state my position, which is that I'm a cosmopolitanist. I believe that morals overstep state lines. I believe that morals and reason and social responsibility oversteps sovereign boundaries. I believe the same things apply to all of us. One of the entertaining things in Europe, and you may all know this already, so I don't think this will be news to you. One of the entertaining things about being a European is listening to a lot of news coverage in America, which appears to really confine itself to itself. It's as if there's an island called America, and apparently nothing else exists, which is interesting. My historian colleague will obviously be able to fill you in on the details of how that came to be. But here's the thing. Let me just close with this thought. When we talk about liberal, and we use it in the American context, we start by asking itself, we're posing a very interesting question. Am I talking about John Stuart Mill's notion of responsibility, do no harm? Or am I talking about Friedrich von Hayek's idea of liberty, which is everything is a marketplace, everything is competition, everything is open to a price? Now, it seems to me they're entirely different things, and they are not about rebranding. That's about distortion. Clearly. Discuss.
Okay. I want to let everybody know we have about, unfortunately, only 5 more minutes of this, but luckily we're going to be reconvening, and I'm imagining the reconvening is going to be a continuation of this discussion. So 5 more minutes of open discussion, and then we'll bring this episode to a close. So please respond to Paul.
So this is exactly why I'm in conflict now about the English roots of history, right? But the description that you gave of Hayek fits with, the Adam Smith, I thought neutral, beneficent Scottish Enlightenment. The market takes care. And now I understand, and that's what Deirdre McCloskey was arguing. And now I get that there's more to it than that. And particularly that there's a theological lie at the core of the claim of these impersonal forces working to good, right? That you left out a proper understanding of providence, which a Catholic perspective would push back against, and saying, that actually English economics is founded on theft, and beginning with the theft of the property of the monasteries. And among those statues that are burned in 1538, it's also everything's been stolen from the English. Stolen from the communities that have built up over 1,000 years of the Middle Ages, of investing by the community in their own charitable organizations, aka the monasteries, right? So, I mean, Paul, I'm totally with you. It's like our vision as Americans needs to include the deep history of England and the systems that we brought over and then enshrined into our political documents. And so one of the things I do, so as a teacher, is I've developed a course on medieval England, and the number of times you're going, and now you understand why Parliament is able to choose the king, and therefore why the English settlers thought they could do it too and get rid of him and so forth. Parliament had already done it several times. And that deep history of how long it takes to develop political, economic, social institutions. And, my deep sense as a conservative is Chestertonian, in the sense of you need to understand what you're destroying if you're going to start dismantling everything, but maybe it does need reform.
There's no doubt that capitalism is in its early stages, and it is something of an adolescent. So my kind of response immediately would be that if we remove the responsibility and only have an interpretation of liberty as Hayek does, which was a very influential point, and he, in a sense, becomes a co-architect with Friedman for the Anglo-American change of capitalist economics. I think we, do run the risk of talking about rights and not talking about responsibilities. Clearly, responsibilities were where this debate began. And if you go back to the Synoptic Gospels, as again, Rachel, you are an expert clearly, the Synoptic Gospels are very clear on this point. This is about provision. This is about responsibility. This is about looking after others. This is a deeply Judaic point. It is not a discreetly Christian point. It's just an interesting interpretation of Judaism. So yeah, I don't know. I wonder if I'm guilty of being precious about John Stuart Mill. I hope not.
I think on that note, we're going to have to move to the closing rounds. And I am so glad now that we've begun this discussion that we're going to be able to meet again and continue on in 2 weeks, and maybe a little bit in the meantime on Facebook. But now it's time to bring the dialogue to a close, and you will each have up to 2 minutes to speak in response to the following questions. Questions. What will you take away from this dialogue, an idea or memory or something that you learned? And is there something that you would like to add to bring the dialogue to a satisfying closure? Again, this will be a popcorn round. Whoever would like to start, please feel free.
Well, I'll say that I was surprised in a way to find that there was room for my ideas here, and I hear others who have similar ideas about conservatism and religion, and that I'm very happy about that. I think when I asked myself the question, compared to the media, why are we able to be so open about our own beliefs? It's because we're not getting paid and we're not looking to get paid. We're sharing something without anything but intellectual and emotional remuneration.
I think that's a great point. The only thing I would like to add is a slight extension to the rationale behind my assertion that we can't negotiate from a position of core truth. And it goes like this, if I am thinking clearly. If we enter into any dialogue with a friend or a stranger, and we say, this is the right and the good, what do you think? That's not a great starting point. A much better starting point, it seems to me, and it appears to have occurred to Habermas, strangely enough, is the assertion, can we discuss the right and the good? Now that, it seems to me in a very simple way, is an entirely different discussion. That doesn't come from my absolute truth. That doesn't come from my absolute center. That says, I'm looking for consensus. And this is what's so poorly missing from a lot of cultural debate in the public sphere, in my estimation.
I think connecting directly to that, 100%, again, as someone who identifies as South Asian American or Asian American, what have you, I think a big problem actually sometimes when we put these cultural markers or within these kind of communities, hyphenated communities, is that people believe that in order to belong, they have to agree.
Sure.
Right? And when I was younger, people would ask me, which country do you like better? Right? But then as I've gotten older, I realized that I am 100% Indian and I'm 100% American. And but that identity of mine is my own, and I can only speak for myself. That's the other thing that, you know, getting older and realizing that I'm only speaking for myself, I'm not speaking for anyone else. But when you allow yourself and you tell yourself that you're not speaking for anyone, you're just speaking for your experiences, and this is my voice, then I feel like it opens up a certain amount of freedom for the dialogue, right? And that's something that has just resonated with me. And I don't know, I'm going to end with this quote I've always loved. When William Faulkner accepted his Nobel Prize, he said, "Man will not merely endure, he will prevail." And I think I apply that to kind of the American spirit, is that this is a nutty time to be an American and to like reflect on what it means to be an American. But I do believe that America will prevail, and hopefully, according to for Paul, they will start to think of themselves not as an island. Hopefully. So
I'm going to be contrary. But the thing that thinking what Paul said about his core concern starting with fear, right? And I have practiced being in the public sphere a little bit, and having to deal with the fear and getting down to the, you know, the core problem of, indeed, it does matter whether people accept you and whether you can have some sense of not being completely ostracized, because we die alone. And you know, even in medieval monasticism, being a hermit was considered a pretty stressful exercise. And I don't, you know, we need to figure out ways to exist together with some level of consensus. Otherwise, we can't exist together. And you could say, you know, so we've touched on the concern about policing. You know, do we in the United States accept the law as the thing under which we all agree to live? How do we make it? Who's sovereign? When you have a king, you have, you know, a particular individual will, but this political experiment that we're in is making of the, you know, the sort of generality sovereignty. And that means we don't get out of this without making some kind of agreement to the things that we're actually going to live by. So we are going to be back in this situation over and over and over again. I mean, the degree to which you're afraid to speak up, to say things that your neighbors might not agree with, your colleagues might not agree with, your friends might not agree with, I think is representative of the, you know, we've created a political entity that depends on having some level of agreement at some point. And my example of Portland and the states' rights, it's ironic because, of course, we think of the South as saying, you know, states' rights was to preserve slavery, but there would have been no war if the North just said, fine, go, right? And there are plenty of people out in the political sphere right now who are saying, oh, fine, you know, let the United States break up, fine, go. But what does that say, right? It's saying that the agreement is broken down, let everybody go to hell as he or she votes. I don't know how we get out of this without having to confront some real differences.
So just for me in closing, I really enjoyed our conversation, and I think I will take away the memory of the conversation and look forward to it continuing. And I really do believe in the possibility of this type of model. I think that I've reflected in the last 2 hours also on the value of facilitation. I think that's important. To me, initially, I'm just like, oh, everybody could just talk. Why do we have to go through these steps? But I see the value in that. And what else? I think it's important that we do, as Paul said, think about how to, you know, bring this out of just an academic context where we can all, you know, talk about things that maybe not everyone in the society would be able to articulate on a moment's notice about. So I think that's important to consider. And in about 10 more seconds, my daughter will probably come on screen. And I think if I was just getting ready, that's really the reason why we all continue to do this. So I thought that would be a good way to close. But, oh, she doesn't have a shirt on, so we're not going to do that. So that's me.
All right. Am I the last one?
I believe you are, Valerie.
I am struck by the fact that we are more similar than different, at least just judging by this conversation. I'm wondering if these labels that we call ourselves are just political constructs, because, you know, when it all boils down to it, I think we agree more on, you know, more than we disagree. And I would love for our country to get to the point where we can navigate those differences and not do it in such a hostile way. And I guess the challenge becomes, how do you, I guess for lack of a better word, politicize what just occurred here? And when I say that, I'm not saying that, you know, we should take political sides. I think there should be some sort of groundswell to demand that our government is more transparent, more accountable, and takes into account different perspectives. Right now, I just feel like we're just so polarized, and the powers that be seem to have a vested interest in keeping us polarized. But if we can just open our eyes and see, and I guess I know that sounds so idealistic, but it's very scary to see how much we're alike, even though we call ourselves something different. And it seems to run counter to, you know, the dominant thought that's out there in the media.
Thank you so much. We have 3 more minutes. Alice, did you want to say something in closing?
Yeah, I've been very pleased with how easy it's been for us to just get to know each other and to see that we are more alike than different. One of the ways I think when I talk to my patients and other people is how to be true to myself, true to the other person, and just plain true in some objective sense at the same time. And that's a very complex idea. And the idea that I can play with that question with other people and talk about your truths and my truths, and let's find an objective truth, just opening up play spaces that aren't about, the polarization, which camp are you in? And I think the fact that we could do it rather easily, a first pilot project, suggests that more can be done, and it should be marketed. And I hope we can do it again with other groups.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking forward to the Facebook group. The participants who watch the panel are free to join. You can search for Dialogue with Dignity on Facebook and ask to join. And then we can continue the discussion for 2 weeks and meet again on the 16th and see where we went with it.
Oh, awesome.
I see a baby about to enter the frame. Yeah.
Hey.
The next generation.
Serafina.
So one of the things that occurs to me, do I have like 10 seconds?
You have, yes, exactly 60 seconds left.
I'll take less.
20.
I'll take less. It seems to me that what we're doing does need to happen every generation. Because if it doesn't happen every generation, they make the same damn mistakes.
Yeah.
Or am I just...
Paul, there was a baby present. All right, let's go with darn in the American parlance. Okay.
No, we'll be damned if we don't. I think he's right.
This is like my friend who grew up Mennonite who was told she couldn't say H-E-L-L, so she had to say H-E double hockey sticks.
Wow. Wow. That's... I was kind of hoping she was pre-verbal.
All right, well, that is our exact time. So thank you, everybody, so much for participating. I think it went really well. And I'll plan to see you all back here again in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Alice,
you.
Nikki.
And
Thank you, Elsa, Nikki.
next time you will see me.
Oh, good. We would love to see your face. That would
Yeah, I am so sorry. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
No problem. We made it work.
Technology.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.